All right. Today's webinar guest is Dr. Mark Grant. Mark is a long-time rail cybersecurity leader. He worked at CSX in the US for about 25 years, spent 17 years in cybersecurity, and served as Chief Information Security Officer for 8 years during his time with CSX. Today, Mark has a rail cybersecurity consulting practice called RiskSec Group. So Mark, welcome to today's webinar.
Thank you, Omar.
Mark, today we are going to be discussing about the technical specification TS-50701, data applicability, and some research you've developed to help companies justify the implementation of these specification requirements. So the TS, it's an European standard which deals with the railway applications cybersecurity. It provides non-mandatory requirements, guidelines, and recommendations for the protection of the rail applications through its life cycle. Is there any equivalent document in the US?
Well, I think the way I would answer that question is not directly, but kind of yes. And I say that for a couple of reasons. And the first is that clearly there's nothing that would stop US railroads from looking at the standard, embracing the standard, and adapting it within their own environment. So, I think it's available for people in the US. I know there's been some discussion, of adoption, of pushing kind of for more adoption in the US. And I think that, folks are looking at it. And there are some differences, but I don't think they're meaningful differences when it comes to the standard, but there are some differences when you look at sort of European rail networks and US rail networks. US, I think, tends to have a lot more freight focused versus passenger. So that, there are some differences in the environments. However, when you look at the underlying technologies that are in use, and clearly the TS-50701 contains some very useful models, for example, of rail technologies. And if you look at the underlying technologies, oftentimes they're very similar, and in some cases, they come even from the same suppliers. So we have a lot of sort of global suppliers that that people use across the world. So the technology and suppliers are very similar. And there are some other frameworks and standards which are used in the US. The NIST is an example of a framework that is widely adopted and looked at in railroads. I know that. I've worked with a number of railroads that use that. And it does, consider OT environments as well as the IT environment, not as specific to railroads. And that's the beauty of the TS-50701. It's very specific to railroads and can be very helpful. So there are some framework standards available that are used in the US. Pieces of them, are in the TS-50701. And I think there's an opportunity that it could be used more broadly in the US.
See. Mark, the TS primarily applies to the operational environments of the rail operators, something we usually call the rail tech environment. And larger rail operators can have over 40 different operational systems, right, or rail applications in their environments. How can the operators undertake the titanic task of adapting these systems and applications so that they comply with these kind of standards?
Yeah, I think there are probably a couple of important concepts, and these concepts are actually embedded in the standard. And the first one that I think about is sort of a risk management approach. So, operators, wherever they are, in general, understand, which systems are more important than others. And, it's not easy because there are a lot of systems, as you pointed out. And in some cases, there are, a lot of interconnections between the OT environment and the IT environment. So, these systems are sort of integrated in a complex way, both in the OT environment in some cases and also across to the IT environment. And, companies do that because there's so much useful operational information that is housed in these OT environments in many cases. And then we use that information and leverage it across the business in some of their other systems. So there's oftentimes, interfaces. And so, you know, uh, so the concept of sort of risk management, how you think about that environment becomes super important. What systems are safety critical, which systems are directly connected, to the rail environment, and in general, those systems that are, most integrated with the operations, maybe on the locomotive, on rolling stock in general, or on the wayside next to the tracks or in the yards. Those systems are most critical to business operations, and they're also the most attractive target in terms of being attacked and oftentimes have safety implications. So, it's really that thoughtful approach of risk management to understand, what the systems do, how do they support the business, and how attractive are they from a targeting perspective, and how difficult would they be to attack. And that, concept in terms of the, thinking about the security levels of the various environments in that, that operate your railroad, that is also included, that concept's included in the, in the standard. So I think, the issue is, in the short term, I think to focus when you're looking at the OT environment, clearly changes that require, getting into the meat of the architecture and the meat of the code and making modifications, certainly in a kind of brownfield environment where you have existing systems already, is very difficult. That's not something that's going to happen, in the short term. It's going to take on the order of years instead of weeks or months to meaningfully move the needle on the technical interactions. But having said that, there's plenty of things you can do, that don't require you to kind of rewire things and rework some of your code. So, I think that's the right way to focus if you're starting and applying the standards, is focus in those areas where you can make meaningful improvements, with monitoring and detection, for example, with, the way you manage the assets, the way you logically segment the environment. Those are the areas where you can make the most meaningful impact in a short time frame.
Yep. Okay, and Mark, I know you are working with a variety of different rail operators there in the US, helping them to prepare for the implementation of the specific US security directives. So generally, how do you think the industry is doing, and what are some of their biggest challenges when it comes to implement cybersecurity for those complex environments?
Yeah, so I would say right now that the security directives in the U.S. are generating an awful lot of effort, because the railroads are working, directly with the TSA. The TSA has set up a structure for engaging with the railroads. They've brought people in, they've kind of staffed up for it, so they're making meaningful interactions across the rail sector. And in general, the rail sector has had for decades a strong focus on cybersecurity. So they're not starting from scratch. So, sort of depending on the maturity of the programs, the security programs at the various railroads, some of the railroads are viewing the directives as more of the distraction because they have a good program, but now they're having to do a lot of additional, sort of paperwork and compliance activities that they didn't plan. But, there are some railroads who don't have this mature program, and typically there's you're looking at the difference between like the large railroads, the large freight railroads, will have mature programs, but some of the smaller programs, railroads, which may have, hundreds of miles, versus tens of thousands of miles of track, they likely don't have the same level of resourcing. They don't have the same maturity. And so they're, needing to invest more to comply with the regulations. And, it's difficult for some of the smaller railroads, I think, in terms of the cost and the additional work. And they have, more work to do because they haven't, the maturity of their program just isn't at the same level. Now, having said that, they also have, in many cases, much less risk. In some cases, some of the railroads can operate largely manually, and so their compliance efforts for them also seem like a bit of a distraction from what they're normally trying to do. But in general, I think the industry is doing well, and everybody is, I think everyone should, over the course of the next several years, become compliant.
Okay. So I propose that we have a look on what our audience thinks about these challenges. So let's go with the first survey. Here we are. So I let you a few seconds to reply. Okay, hopefully everybody has answered already. So let's see the results. Okay, what do you think, Mark?
Yeah. So it looks like, well, the good news is we didn't have anybody answer, I don't know. And, it does look like, folks are thinking about it and, looking at what gaps they have.
Mm-hmm. And we see that at least the majority of the people answering, at least it's well aware of the gaps, right? They has been doing first assessment, which is good.
Yeah, not surprising.
Good. Okay, so Mark, what do you think are the main benefits and opportunities that operators can get of using a standard such as the TS-50701 on their rail tech environments?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the goal of the standard is to improve security and reduce cybersecurity risk, which I think also is potentially going to have a commensurate increase in the level of safety of the railroad and reduction of operational disruption. So there's a lot of good potentially of a solid implementation of the framework if it indeed leads to an improvement in the cybersecurity, which it should. And there are also some other sort of benefits that you get from that. And I think clearly the standard itself, particularly some of the models that are included in the language that becomes, as more people adopt it, it becomes a bit of a common language that people can speak, so to speak. So that the impact to the individual railroads, and then if you think about the broader ecosystem that goes into securing an environment, it clearly includes suppliers, it includes communication in some cases with government agencies, and as people sort of crystallize around a common framework or common standard to have those conversations, it really increases the overall level of communication and collaboration in a better way. And particularly with the suppliers, as they begin to adopt these things because they see their customers are interested in it, I think that's where you can really drive meaningful impact. In a world where, in particular railroads, where there's often interoperability requirements amongst railroads, IT systems in one railroad in some cases need to be able to communicate with IT systems in another railroad, or OT systems in this case. And that cannot, significant improvements to the security in that environment cannot be delivered without collaboration and some kind of adoption of standards and working out, hey, we need to change these interfaces. Well, everybody sort of has to change at the same time in some cases with these interoperability requirements. So, the suppliers, as they adopt them, I think that's really going to start driving, driving improvements and overall and improve the overall security of these rail tech environments
Yeah.
over time.
Now that you mentioned the suppliers, I know usually these kind of standards are seen as an additional cost, right? So do you think that the adoption of the TS can in fact bring benefits for them, for the rail integrators, the rail manufacturers, and all the supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, um, I think yes. I mean, clearly they're potentially going to look to pass some of those costs on to the customers. But over time, it should lead, to a more efficient process. And, already, typically as the suppliers, certainly, clearly for some of these operational technologies, they're already needing to work with customers to kind of iron out the technical details. And, so the more you can do that within a framework that people understand and, begin to sort of, look at the various ways the zoning, impact. Because if you look at the underlying technologies in most railroads, it's very similar. The zoning that's proposed in the standard, applies in most cases. We talked about the fact that many of the suppliers are very common. So, any kind of standards that can help them kind of speed up the design process, help those conversations be easier and develop, moving the framework and the standard into an actual technical implementation that includes those concepts. The easier that gets, the faster and more efficient that's going to be.
The TS scope is limited to the OT systems, while for the IT systems, other standards such as the ISO 27000 are much more relevant. So I propose we see what's the view for our audience with another survey. So let's ask them from where they think that the higher risk is coming from IT or from OT. Let's see if the survey is popping up. Here you go. Okay, so maybe let's see the results. So what do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I think
Same
that probably reflects the way most people feel about attacks on IT systems and the possibility that those will bleed over because of some of the interconnectedness, bleed over into the OT environments. And we've seen that happen, in a number of cases. Even if the OT systems aren't directly impacted, a lot of times companies, when responding to a significant incident, will turn off those interfaces, increase the segmentation. And because, in some cases they haven't ever done that before, it leads to disruptions even in the OT environment. And, it's in some cases not a clear distinction between IT and OT, in terms of how they impact the business. There are many IT systems which are critical to operations as well, and particularly the planning systems in railroads and sort of the, understanding where things are at and where they're coming from and what to expect. So I'm not surprised that people see both of those as risk.
Yeah. Also, I guess it depends a lot of the approach you take, right? Because if you think on the likelihood, probably you will tend to vote for IT, while if you think on the impact, the component of the risk, you will that it's more relevant in the end. You will vote more for the OT.
That's exactly right. And people definitely see more activity, in their IT environment that they have to respond to on a daily basis. The OT environment from a security perspective is usually relatively calm, from a cybersecurity perspective. We don't see a lot of incidents there. Traditionally, we haven't as in the rail industry. And I think I think in order to get into them and really make a meaningful impact, apart from bleed over, kind of consequences from, say, ransomware or something like that, you really would expect to have a very sophisticated adversary that was targeting your environment.
Fully agree. So, Mark, let's talk now about your research. You've developed a tool that can help rail operators justify an investment in rail cybersecurity requirements. Namely, we are talking about capabilities like automated asset discovery, vulnerability, risk management, and ongoing threat detection and response. So I assume this tool can help CISOs or cybersecurity teams justify implementing these capabilities, even if they are not based specifically on the TS-50701. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the research that we have done, the work that we've done recently, really, came out of some discussions that we had with folks about, hey, I have a really good security project, but I'm having difficulty getting that funded because I think, as you think about how projects get funded in organizations, there are typically many stakeholders involved in funding decisions. And that would certainly be the case for any large investment, like if you had an initiative to undertake, sort of TS-50701 implementation and become compliant with that, that may be a large investment. Or if you just have a big, security project, the people that make decisions in organizations, how money gets spent, there are a lot of different stakeholders that weigh in on that. And your security request, if you're a CISO, in many cases is going to compete with other business initiatives. So maybe the railroad needs to do some capital investment on track. Maybe you need some more locomotives. Maybe you need a new customer ticketing system for your railroad. And so these are important initiatives for the business, which it's clear what the benefit to the business is for these initiatives. And if you're sitting around the table as a CISO and you have a security project, you're really talking about risk reduction, which is a much softer, in many cases, benefit that you're asking people to understand. And it's also rather conceptual. It's like, well, don't talk to me about this conceptual bad thing that might happen in the future when I have these real issues that I'm trying to address right now from a business perspective. And so, as we've talked to people and thought about it, I think one of the potential reasons that some projects don't get funded, even though we know that they're good projects as a security person, vital projects, is because we aren't thinking about that holistic business case in some cases. And so, we did some work to talk to folks and think about, hey, what are some of the other items that you might include when you're putting together your business case and you're going forward with funding that are benefits to the business that may be more concrete and you may not think about, but you probably should for many projects, because oftentimes there are benefits sort of beyond just the risk reduction, security risk reduction benefit that you can articulate. And it is a little bit of a different approach potentially for some CISOs because it requires additional conversations with the business because in most of the times when you're putting together a business case, you don't do that on your own. You've got sort of the finance people there with you, and they're doing the math on the ROI and comparing it with other projects, and they're going to hold your feet to the fire if you claim benefits that aren't there. But I think if you are talking to other, maybe some of the folks in your operations departments, potentially even marketing departments, legal departments, and engaging them in the conversation when you put your business case together and talking to them about some of the potential benefits you're going to see, both in, security department, in the IT department in general, and then finally, to the broader business. I think in many cases there is an opportunity to make sort of a more compelling, holistic return on investment that you could take forward to have a better opportunity to have a shot to compete against some of the other initiatives that are out there.
In fact, when you are looking at the benefits of implementing cybersecurity, avoiding costly cybersecurity incidents seems like an obvious starting point, right? Is that something you consider?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a big one. Again, oftentimes, if your company isn't having a lot of costly cybersecurity incidents, avoiding them, is really more of a soft benefit. In other words, if you implement, a new tool or a new product, and you're not having a lot of cybersecurity incidents, it's not likely that you're going to, be able to reduce your staff or, change your budget because of that. So it is a soft benefit. But, these things are very costly when they happen. And, there's a bullet point down at the bottom that talks about sort of the average IT impact or the average cost impact from OT security incidents, and this came from some recent research. It's expensive. It's in the millions of US dollars. And some of them are very expensive, in the greater than $100 million if the disruption is lengthy. And I guarantee you, if you have one of these costly incidents, you're going to have no problem, getting funding. It's, the company's going to be, yeah, we need to invest more in this and we need to do it fast. Matter of fact, you're probably going to have the other problem. You're going to have the problem where, you don't have enough resources to actually, spend the money that's been given to you. And another problem, quite frankly, is may not be your problem anymore. If you're the CISO, it may be the next the next person's problem to try to fix it, because sometimes the CISO doesn't survive those. But the key is to build your business case and get the funding before you have the costly incident and have a better chance of avoiding that. So that's really the goal. But yeah, definitely that should be a part of your case you take for us. Say, hey, look, these are the things that could happen. This is where we have gaps, and it should be a conversation. Hopefully, you're having with your board of directors at your organization to make sure they understand where you're at from a risk perspective.
Mm-hmm. So I propose that we check with the audience whether their rail operations have been impacted by a cybersecurity incident lately. So let's have another quick survey here. Let's wait a few seconds. Okay, now you can have a look now to the results. Okay, so
yeah,
we see
that makes sense.
we see that in most cases, there is no incidents or operations as expected.
Yeah.
Any takeaways from the results?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is what I would have expected to see. You know, in general, we don't hear about significant impacts to rail operations from cybersecurity incidents. It happens very infrequently. Um, you know, you know, and I think this also is one of the reasons that you have, in some cases, trouble funding. If you do have trouble, you may be having it because, well, the leadership of your company and the decision makers that decide on these investments don't perceive that there's a huge problem, and they're like, "Hey, we haven't had big issues, so why are you continuing to invest?" So the reality is, I think it's more likely that the rails just haven't been targeted by some of the more sophisticated actors to the same extent that some of the other industries have, and that's probably why there's a lack of significant incidents. And I think most people realize it doesn't mean there's not an opportunity to have a significant incident. It just hasn't happened to a great extent.
I fully agree. I tend to call that the paradox of cybersecurity, where when you are not having incidents because maybe you are having a solid security program, you get more issues, right? To get the funding for improving it further.
That's exactly right. And people in reality in railroads are very good at reacting to bad things that happen because when you're running a railroad, there are a lot of opportunities for bad things to happen just because of the nature of the business. They're normally not cybersecurity incidents, but when you try to talk to the operations folks about a hypothetical bad thing, they don't want to talk about it because they have bad things that are happening on a daily basis. It's like, yeah, don't talk to me because my hair's on fire sort of response. So, that's why those conversations are sometimes difficult.
Mark, besides avoiding cybersecurity incidents, what are some of the other key hard benefits that you help clients identify to justify these investments on cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think I've got a deck. I've got some of these, maybe some points there we can look at. All right, the next one. All right, so this is actually related to what we were just discussing. It's like the bad things that happen, sort of on a daily basis. In some case, in some railroads, not all railroads have these, but you know, many railroads are, and particularly, um, uh, the larger railroads, face, sort of delays on, a frequent basis. And the frequency varies, depending on where you're at. And these are not security related events at all. It's just, hey, there's a problem with the IT system, or there's been a change and something has been, messed up. It could be in the IT, it could be in the OT. The OT disruptions are less frequent, but when they happen, they're very costly. The downtime is costly because your railroad's not running. If it's a widespread disruption because of an IT or OT issue, and your operations are down, people are, your crews are sitting idle, you've got people showing up to work, who can't work, you've got people kind of waiting for things to come back online in a lot of cases, and it's a huge waste of money. You've got customer impacts or passenger impacts, depending on what type of railroad you're running, and it's a costly event. So there's an urgency clearly to get these things resolved. Well, what my experience has been, and I think what the research shows, is a majority of the time for many incidents, um, in terms of resolving the problem, is spent actually figuring out, what is the cause, like isolating the issue we talked about earlier. These OT environments are very complex. There's a lot of integration, a lot of moving parts that make the thing work. And in many cases in the OT environment, you have significantly less visibility in terms of the mechanics of what's going on. And it requires a lot of expertise and a lot of people engaged to track at a detailed level exactly where the problem's at. And the way these things, and we've all been, or many of us have probably been on these calls, for whatever reason, they always tend to happen in the middle of the night, but something is broken. You get all the people that you can find, all the technical people you can find in, everybody looks at their individual components and they try to figure out what's going on. And then finally someone, identifies, something anomalous and say, hey, maybe this is the problem. And then you look and you finally figure it out. So a lot of time is spent doing that. And the other thing that's been my experience is the security team is often, one of the first teams that gets called. And that's for two reasons. One is if you have an IT outage, you aren't sure what caused it, you immediately think, well, it could be a security issue, so we should get the security folks looking at it. And the other reason is I think security tools, because of the goal of the tool is really to have visibility into the environment and to look for anomalies, the security tools often provide, one of the best views into what is going on. So when you think about these tools and, who uses the tools, if you have a security tool, my suggestion is you should expand the way you think about your security tools, and you should be looking at, tools that help with security, but also, potentially bring additional enterprise value. And this is one area where, you can bring significant additional value with the security tools that you want to implement. So not only is it going to help your security, but in many cases, we've seen these tools can streamline the problem resolution process. And this can be a hard benefit because, your environment, depending on how many issues you face on a daily basis or weekly basis, is staffed, based on, that kind of certain level of disruptive events in your system. And in some cases, I've seen, particularly for new OT systems, and there's really good examples, here in the US with some of the automatic braking systems where, it's a fairly new system and they will have a team, of 24/7 technicians who do nothing but look at log files and try to identify, false enforcement of braking, for example, or other issues that are commonly occurring across the railroad. And this is for big railroads. So they're already spending money as an organization on teams to troubleshoot these issues and help bring clarity and identify the failure. And a lot of times you end up with, recurring failures, but you have to do the work to figure out, is it one of those examples or is it a new example that we haven't seen before? So there's this activity that takes place with these teams and it's costly. And so anything you can do that streamlines that process, because you can have greater visibility with the tool, or maybe the tool helps you with other tasks like, keeping track of assets and helps reduce work in other areas. But this, resolving non-security problems in some cases can be a big driver. That isn't hard ROI if you've got a team of 20 people working on these types of issues around the clock, and you can streamline that. And with a security tool, that brings them benefit as well. Potentially you could do that same work with fewer people because you're resolving the issues quicker. And that leads directly to reductions in delays and reductions in all employees. So it becomes a hard benefit. This is another example, and it may or may not apply depending on which country you're in. And I've got an example here from the U.S. just because I'm familiar with it. But, if you face regulatory fines or penalties, and in some cases, you may already be getting regulatory fines and penalties around noncompliance, and this becomes then an easy part of your business case. But the example here I give is from the TSA reg, where you face potential, up to 12,000 US dollars for not patching a system that your policy says, hey, we're going to patch our systems, we're really good at it. Definitely, we're going to patch them. That's what your policy says. And when you don't do that, the TSA, has an opportunity to identify that as a failure of noncompliance, and they can fine you, $12,000. But the issue you might run into is maybe you've got 100, maybe you've got a control system, with widely distributed in your environment. You've got 100 of these, control points, for example, that you haven't addressed vulnerability management on, you didn't patch, and then that, penalty then is, potentially becomes a significant amount of money. If got 100 and you're getting fined $8,000 a pop, that's that's nearly $1 million. So this is something you can include in your business case. Say, hey, look, this is the potential impact, and risk managers will understand that, because you may or may not have seen penalties in the past, but regulation and the enforcement of regulation tends to evolve over time. And my experience has been that it gets more onerous over time. Here's another example, this streamlining security team. Everybody knows that kind of, your SOC team is probably overwhelmed with, volumes. There's a lot of threats they have to track. They see activities that they have to trace down on a daily basis. Even in small companies where you may not have a full-blown SOC capability, there are likely things that you need to do or that you want to do that you're not able to because of staffing limitations. And so, the security implementation and in a regulatory environment, you may be pushed to do these things, and you may be looking at, hey, we don't have a big SOC now, but we know we're going to have one by, in 2 years or whatever, to be compliant. And, if it's not regulation, maybe you're adopting the TS-50701, you realize you're going to have to invest in these areas. You have two, options. You can either hire a bunch of people to do that work, or you can invest in automation that helps do it in a streamlined environment. So, clearly this one should be in there. Most people would include this in a security project if it was going to move the needle. But, I think to make a good business case, you have to, you really have to focus on identifying as an opportunity, and then you have to push yourself, as an organization. If you say you can do the work with fewer people, you have to make that move, and then redeploy those people into other meaningful work, or or let them go if that's what you're faced with. But so a good examples of areas where this automation can really help you is asset and patch management. Clearly, you try to do that manually in the OT environment, which a lot of people still do. Asset management and even patch management in the OT environments manually, because there just hasn't been robust tooling. I think it's now becoming available in the last several years, but before that it was more difficult. And at the bottom line is security automation. In many cases, you can deliver more capability, more accurate, more timely, and with fewer resources. So this is another area where investment oftentimes makes sense.
Yeah, this is super interesting because, in fact, most of the time, when you look at justify an investment in cybersecurity, you tend to look at the obvious, no, what you mentioned before, of the direct fines or the direct cost that can suppose to you an incident, while this kind of soft benefits can really make a much more solid business case, right? To try to get the finance you need, the money you need to push forward your security program.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you can, again, it takes additional effort to put the business case together because you have to engage with other people. If you say, hey, look, I think with more visibility, we can help reduce the staff in your department, because we can provide additional visibility, and the work that you're doing manually to figure things out is going to be much more streamlined. Well, you have to have the agreement of that of that other person who manages that team, that's going to happen. So, it does force, more conversations, but they're healthy conversations anyway. Often tell people, one of the best things you can do, as a CISO is to get closer to the business and have, more business relationships. So, having those conversations is a healthy part of the process. But yeah, I think you're right. And where you want to end up is a project, when you take it forward, it's got a positive ROI, or at least it breaks even. If it breaks even from a cost perspective, like we're going to invest this money, but we're going to recoup costs in these other areas. And by the way, we're going to get these additional security benefits, or we're going to, be able to, to become compliant with this standard, which we've all agreed is important. So, that becomes much easier to fund. Okay, next slide. Yeah, just a couple of other considerations that you want to make sure you're thinking about when you're putting together these things. And we've kind of bundled this all up in sort of a spreadsheet exercise that certainly your finance people would be able to to really enjoy. But other considerations, a lot of times you may have some technologies already deployed that do some of these things, security tools or other tools. If you can collapse multiple tools into a single tool, that's better, and get rid of existing tools. I think that's the suboptimal technology. So a lot of times you can pay for a new implementation by reducing the cost of some tools that are not bringing as much value. That one typically people would think of, when they're trying to put it together. But again, just a reminder not to forget it. And another one, which increasingly I have seen people adopt, and it's a little bit more difficult in an OT environment where you may have more network segmentation, but it's not impossible. It's moving from on-premise solutions into cloud solutions. Almost in every case that I've been involved in where we've done that, we have gotten a better cost point in the cloud solution, just on a tooling perspective, one-to-one comparison, and the functionality has been better. And the examples, I think people are doing more of this all the time, but that doesn't even account for sort of the infrastructure and other IT costs that you need to maintain for an on-premise solution. You've got staff that are working on that stuff, patching the servers and maintaining and replacing the servers, and investing in new servers. So with networking equipment and all that stuff, becomes much more streamlined. And I think people understand that, because now you see railroads that run even, some of their critical systems are running, as a software as a service by a supplier, across the internet. So, people get the cloud thing. And another one that you have to be somewhat careful, but I think there is increasingly a sort of customer aspect to this. So more and more, railroads are getting asked by their customers, hey, what are you doing about cybersecurity? They're getting questioned. They want to, see more information about the robustness of their program, because they're worried about their supply chain, or they're worried about, the passengers, or frustrated because, they aren't trains late or whatever, so the customer aspect of this and the loyalty of those customers, one of the biggest drivers, I think, for passenger rail in terms of people's likelihood to take the train is the thing going to be on time? So, and certainly from a freight railroad perspective, people are worried about their supply chain. So, that's something that, is much more of a soft benefit that can have a significant impact to the bottom line of, of any railroad. And if you're having a lot of problems, that becomes an easy lever to talk about. Hey, let's focus on reducing these problems, and it's going to drive additional revenue.
That's super interesting. And I'm wondering how has your research been received so far by your clients?
I'm sorry, I said again more.
Yeah, how has your research been received so far by your clients? What is the feedback you are getting from?
Oh, yeah, well, we
from them
got a
so
lot
far?
of feedback in development. We talked to a number of people, and we talked to folks as the product became available, and I think it's been good. And again, it's not the kind of thing where you can use a cookie cutter approach. These are suggestions. They need to be tailored to the individual kind of circumstances. But yeah, I mean, I think people kind of welcome the idea of, hey, this gives us a starting point we can work through, and maybe we can make a more compelling business case. So, I think in general, the response has been very good.
Something you want to add on this last slide?
No, I think that wraps it up. I mean, it's just, this, think about the cost, think about the benefits, really think about your tools as more of an enterprise tool versus a security tool. In my last role, we really focused on getting additional, giving access to visibility to some of the information we looked at from a security perspective, and we saw benefits, particularly across the IT shop with other areas from doing that.
So Mark, before we get to the Q&A, you're a former CISO at a major rail operator in the US. What's your last bit of advice for current rail operators, CISOs, and the cybersecurity teams about the adoption of standards such as the TS-50701?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the standards, again, have an opportunity to really move the industry forward. So it's not even specifically about your railroad. I think adoption, particularly with the suppliers. I mean, when you talk to suppliers, a lot of times they'll say, you talk to them about security, OT suppliers in particular, and what they'll say is, that's nice, but we aren't working on that because our customer, which tends to be the operations people in railroads, are asking us to work on something else. So we would love to improve the security. We would love to engage with you on a standard or a framework. We would love to make things better, but the customer's asking for something else. So these frameworks and these sort of standards help set the bar at a certain point, and that continually can be moved forward in a way that everybody understands the target, and everybody can speak the same language about what's happening. So
All right, we have 5 minutes left, so let's answer a few questions from the audience. Let me review what we are receiving. Maybe we can start with this one that is pretty practical. So someone is asking how they can get a copy of your research, Mark, if they need to contact you directly.
yeah, and you can reach out to me. I think we had my address up there. So send me an email, mark@risksecgroup.com.
Yeah, we have it in the screen, your mail. We have another question that is asking what is the difference between the TS-50701 and the IEC 63452. And maybe I take this one,
Yeah.
Mark. So the,
Yep.
the the difference is that the IEC 63452, it's an international standard from the IEC that it's still under development. That is going to cover cybersecurity for railway industry. While the TS, it's having a local scope for Europe, it's coming from Senelec, and it's already published. Say that it's true that the 63452 is going to take a lot of points and a lot of content that was already on the TS, and it will be improved, but it's still under development. So we have still a few minutes. Let me check if we have other. Yeah, that's interesting. Mark, I let you to take this one. Someone is asking, how likely do you think is that the operators voluntarily adopt a standard such as the TS-50701 until there are some laws or regulation really forcing them to do so?
Yeah, I don't know about, I don't know about some of the international regulations. I don't believe that there are regulations that are mandating the adoption. I think certainly in the US market, I think, people have been much more focused on sort of the NIST framework and using that. I think that there's no reason you can't use the NIST framework and sort of the TS-5701 standard. Those two would work well together. I do think from a regulatory perspective, there's not, in my at least that I'm aware, that there's any kind of regulation that forces someone to do it. There may be components of it which are kind of forced by regulation, but I mean, for example, the TSA regulations don't even specify that you have to use NIST, although a lot of people do because it's a common language that you can use with the government because they tend to be focused on it. But yeah, I think over time that may change. I think the other thing that drives people to adopt standards in some cases, I mean, at one point there was a discussion about whether the cybersecurity insurance industry would try to push for some kind of, framework or standard, and something that people could comply with to help them, understand risk whenever they were writing insurance policies. But I think the cybersecurity insurance industry is kind of a little bit in turmoil right now anyway. But so I don't know. Potentially, it could become part of the regulations at some point, but I don't think right now it is.
It's a difficult question. Maybe just to say that we will be, because we are running out of time already, so we will answer all the questions. We have a few other of them, so we'll do that offline. And just to say thank you everybody to attend to the webinar, and to you, Mark, for having this very interesting chat today.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you for hosting and the thoughtful comments.